Hey everybody, Matt here. Thanks for stopping by. So here's the question of the day. What am I going to do with all this space that's up here? So what I decided I'm going to try and do is suspend this metal shelf. It's 4 feet long, 18 inches wide. I want to suspend this from the I-beam up there and make myself a shelf that doesn't occupy any floor space underneath it. Because what I'm finding is the more floor space I have in my shop, the happier I am. So what you're looking at here is a clamp I made several months ago so that I could suspend my bikes up off the floor and hang them from this I-beam, again, to free up the floor space. And so this particular clamp is made with 3 pieces of 2x4. There's one here turned on edge. There's one here sitting on its face and another shorter piece right here. I haven't drilled any holes or scarred the I-beam at all. It's just as I found it. So how this clamps on there is I've got 1, 2, 3 pieces of 1/4 threaded rod that go all the way through, as you see them. And then in between the pieces of 2x4, I have 1/4 MDF spacers, because this edge of the I-beam is 1/4 inch thick. So with the spacers in place, when I tighten up these threaded rods, it very, very securely clamps onto the flange of the I-beam. And from that point, I've screwed in 3 big hooks and then suspended the 3 bikes on each of the hooks. And it's working out great. It's been there for several months and it hasn't moved, twisted, cracked. Nothing's fallen apart. So I'm going to try the same basic idea to suspend this metal shelf on the same I-beam. So that's what I've got in mind. So now it's just a matter of using my sliding miter saw to cut my pieces of wood to length. So as you can see, there's quite a few pieces for each shelf. So what I'm showing here is, rather than measuring to determine where the holes in the wood need to be drilled, I'm going to use the shelf itself. And since I'm using 3/8 of an inch diameter threaded rod, I've got a 3/8 inch bolt, and I'm just positioning the bolt in the shelf and tapping it with a hammer to make a mark on the wood to show where the holes need to get drilled. So off camera, I drilled those 3 holes in the piece of wood that you saw me mark by tapping on the 3/8 bolts. In this scene, I'm using that piece of wood as a template to mark where the other holes need to be drilled. You also see me using those 3/8 bolts as alignment pins. So as I drill each hole, I push a bolt through just to keep the template properly lined up with the workpiece underneath. So I'm using 3/8 of an inch diameter threaded rod, and in this scene I'm using the blade runner to cut the rod to length. Now the rod that I bought is 36 inches long, so I chose to cut the rods in half, making each piece 18 inches. After the rods were cut, I just used the disc sander here to take the burr off the end of the rod. In this scene, you'll see very clearly how the wooden clamp attaches to the I-beam. It was a little bit of a struggle to get the third threaded rod in through the holes, but got it done. With both clamps in place on the I-beam, then I put the next nut and set of washers plus the top clamping board for the shelf itself in place and held everything in with first with tape and then with a small clamp. Now the challenging part starts, trying to lift the shelf into position and hold each end up temporarily with a flat washer and a nut. I deliberately left the I-beam clamps loose so that they would wiggle around a little bit as I got the shelf into position. This seemed to really help out a lot. With the shelf temporarily in place, now comes the next challenging part, and that is to get the bottom piece of wood that clamps the shelf in place into position. You can see that everything is still pretty loose here. That's just to try and make it easier to maneuver things around and get things lined up. A little persuasion with the palm of the hand never hurt. So here's what it looks like with all the wooden pieces in place and the nuts tightened down. I put a level up on the shelf just to verify that it was indeed level. So I chose to use 3 pieces of threaded rod on the end of each shelf just to try and cut down on vibration or any swing that might happen with the shelf. Now in this scene I've got all the nuts tightened up, so the wood is really firmly clamping the shelf in place, and here I'm just pushing on the shelf to see how much it moves around, and was really happy to see that it's pretty firmly in place, doesn't move around much.